Now, today, I wanted to talk about something that affects our community, and I won't go into the stats. You know the stats that police brutalities, police unnecessary murders, or what I call slaughters, are still happening, mostly in the Black and Brown community. And so I thought it very imperative that we talk about all things legal on the Wake Up Podcast, because so many times that issues occur and we don't know our rights, we don't know where to go, we don't know who to address the injustices to. And so today I'm very honored to bring on, I call him a legal expert. He is known as the Voice of New York, former attorney, and he is now currently a legal advocate, none other than Darrell Bennett Jr. Welcome to the Wake Up Podcast, sir. How are you?
Thank you, Bishop. I'm glad to be here, and I'm honored to be able to share some of my wisdom with your audience.
I appreciate your time and your opportunity. And just before we get started on the content, trusting that your family and everything is going well. I know you are located in New York and things are beginning to loosen up a little bit. So trusting that you're doing well, sir, and your family as well.
Yes. Most of my family is in other parts of the country, but they are well, and I'm well here in New York, and we're moving in purpose here because this is a very prescient topic. And New York, I think, is probably leading the country in this discussion right now, maybe for bad, ugly, or not so good. But I believe this is a powerful moment to speak about something like this.
Absolutely. And for those of you that are listening to the podcast, the legal talk that we do are not just limited to police brutality. And I wanted to balance that out, but it's just a podcast to educate us in our rights, in where we stand and what our options are. And so to get right into this, can you give us just a little bit of your legal background? And the reason I always do this is because we boast on the Wake Up Podcast, of course, in a great way, that we bring the best and the brightest and the most knowledgeable people on the podcast based on the subjects that we are discussing. So I kind of always like people to kind of give a little background in that area so people will really say, okay, dude knows what he's talking about.
Absolutely. Well, I have a unique perspective because I have a quite unique path. I grew up in Baltimore, and at 13, I made the decision I wanted to be an attorney. I graduated from Morehouse College and began that journey to law school, which was Harvard Law School. I'm unashamed to say is the most prestigious and I think the best law school in the country. So I had the opportunity to be trained by some of the greatest legal minds, people who've helped write constitutions for other countries, and folks who've sat in positions of great authority and are sitting in positions of great authority. In fact, the dean of the law school at the time, Elena Kagan, of course, now is a Supreme Court justice. So I had the opportunity at Harvard to not just get a legal education, as it were, but to learn from those who are directly molding the system as we know it today and are at the front line of the news. I became an attorney officially at the age of 27 years old and barred in in Maryland. And part of what I talk about, and this is also what makes me an expert on this subject, and I talk about this in my book, Come Back Swinging, and I would love to encourage people to go and read that. Come Back Swinging, and that's available on darrellbennett.com. And I share some of my journey from being at a pinnacle of power to actually being in the system as a defendant in the other chair. And so I got an education of a very different kind, one that I'm proud of, quite frankly, because it allowed me on the inside to really see the practice of the law in a way that I never would have dreamt that it was practiced. And so now I am in a position where I help defend the rights of the accused. I'm an advocate. I work diligently with people on both sides, those who are, snared by the system because I've been there and I've seen it, as well as those that are power brokers that want to change it. And if I can just add this here, one of the things that we're doing here in New York is we're working with city officials to put together a summit, which is going to happen at the end of this month, where we're bringing together the leaders of law enforcement for this city, as well as friends and allies of the reform movement. So I'll bring it full circle to say I'm probably the only person in the country that can say that they were both an attorney and a defendant and graduated from the #1 law school in the country. So I come with a wealth of information and experience and wisdom that, quite frankly, nobody else in this country has, and I think that's why people reach out to speak with me.
And I would encourage you that are listening to get his book, Come Back Swinging.
Come back swinging.
Come Back
Come back
Swinging.
swinging.
And it goes into how no matter what your situation is in life, and I believe that we all are destined to walk a certain journey, and in that journey, it qualifies us for our ultimate destiny. That's what I just simply believe. So there's nothing that happens by mistake. There's nothing, in my opinion, that happens that surprises God. And all of that, as I say, builds our resume. And so now you can be an advocate because you have sat on both sides of the table. So you know both ends of the spectrum. And that is quite dynamic. And that's why I'm so grateful that you've taken the time with your busy schedule to share information with the family. Now, let me ask you a question. You talked about your genesis into law and into the legal field and the schools that you matriculated through. What motivated you to enter into this wide profession, the legal profession? What was the motive? Was it always there, or did you experience something? What motivated you?
I think it's a great question. I know I can identify the age of 13 as particularly me saying I want to be an attorney. I always had within me the desire to do something changing on a global scale. That was always in my heart. And I was drawn initially to government and to politics and to sort of where the people are, as it were, people who are in positions of power. Not power for the sake of power, but power for the sake of influence to empower our communities. You know, growing up in Baltimore, I saw a lot, and I saw things that I just knew on an instinctual level and intuitive level was not right. So I think what I saw as law was the tool. It was the method. It was the vehicle for me to get the credibility and the platform to be taken seriously. You know, I often tell people, you know, I never planned really to practice law. I didn't even go into law school. For me, it was the platform. I saw when people said that they were attorneys, I saw how it changed the game. I mean, look, I almost feel a little silly saying it, but I think I should say it. Philip Banks, who of course is a fictional character, but for those of you that grew up on Fresh Prince, I think that was a motivating factor. I mean, this black man who was a judge, and you know, you saw how he was able to make you know, people shook in their boots. I think of that one episode where Will Smith is in jail and he comes and he says to the jailer, this is Philip Banks as the father, did you call his parents? No, because I'm his parent. Did you call his lawyer? No, because I'm his lawyer. And he said, if you don't let that boy out of that cell, I'm quoting right now, he said, if you don't let that boy out of that cell right now, I will wrap this place up with so much litigation, your grandchildren will need lawyers. And, you know, really that stuck out to me that, wow, this is a man with power. He almost transcended the cultural bondage that tends to hold so many of us in place. So, you know, I guess the short answer to your question, Bishop, is that I saw law as a vehicle, and I still do, as a powerful vehicle for a voice to be heard, for a platform to be built, so people will take you seriously.
And that is powerful. What you said, and I was going to kind of piggyback on the fact that I am so elated that you didn't deny that it was the power that I put it this way, that one of the things that attracted you to this profession was the power, because so many times people deny, people deny the real motive for something because it sounds selfish. But again, you saw law as a power base, not for Darrell, but to be used to help other people. And I think that's what the kingdom of God, and that's what Jesus is all about, that we access certain power, not for ourselves, but to help other people. And yeah, I did see that episode. And it's interesting because it's true. Now, let me piggyback before we get to the next statement, piggyback on your statement. If you look at Congress, if you look at Senate, if you look at most of those female, male, or otherwise in those positions are attorneys or were attorneys at one point. So it is a very powerful
Can I go further, Bishop? Because I think people need to know this.
Yes.
And there are at least a quarter of CEOs that are Fortune 500 companies. At least a quarter of them are trained as attorneys. That's something that a lot of people don't know. How many people use law as a springboard for other things? TMZ, which is one of the largest now it is driven the news cycle, this celebrity news culture. Harvey, I forget his first or last name.
Harvey Levin.
That guy, he's an trained attorney as well. So I think people would be surprised to know how many people there are in the mainstream or who are running companies and businesses that are using. I think it's the most dynamic and quite frankly transformative terminal degree that there is. And it is still one of the most insular communities. Let's be very clear. Because it's very different to say, and this is no shade here, I'm a paralegal, I work at a law firm, whatever, but to be an attorney, it is to say that you graduated with a Juris Doctor from, there are only 141 accredited law schools in the country. It is a very insular community, even still. So when you talk about power, it's there.
And it's active in our lives, whether we know it or not, every single day. I mean, you log on to a website and they say you agree with the terms that nobody reads. That's a legal procedure. I mean, you sign a lease, you sign a mortgage, you get online to enter a particular site. That's a legal arrangement. Do you agree with the terms? You go into your health portal. There's a legal agreement. So we see that this kind of pretty much like no other that I can think of right away, that this legal system pretty much dominates our whole entire planet. It dominates our whole entire life. I mean, you look at in Canada right now, the trucker strike, I think, at the time of this recording, there are like 30,000 truckers at the borders because they are protesting the mandate of the vaccination. That's becoming a legal issue. Now you have attorneys getting involved. So you're right, and it's very attractive. And incidentally, if I can throw this in, though I'm not the guest, I went to Howard to be thinking that I was going to be an attorney, wanted to be the first Black president, but God had other plans. So I majored in political science and minored in economics, getting the math and the politics down, and whoop, got swept into something else. So it is a very lucrative and yet beneficially assist others in their position as you are current legal advocate. What have you learned? Because this field is so vast. About the legal system as a result of being inside of it, and even as you stated earlier on the other side, what things have you learned that you can share that you say, I would have never known this about the system had I not either been in the system or on the other side of the system?
Well, I want to preface this by saying I can speak on this for hours, and I do speak to law schools about this and reform organizations about this and political groups about this because there's so much to be said. But I think the way that I want to raise the conversation here is, and I want to thank the work that you've helped me with, Bishop, personally, just in my own life, through the journey of developing spiritually and through my soul, and I'm going somewhere with this. I think the chief understanding that I came into, which I actually didn't come into until this year. Sometimes you go through an experience and you don't even, you're so whiplashed by it, you have to step back and say, what in the world happened? And this is what I want to say, and I hope people are ready for this. Everything has an intention. And the power of the intention behind what we do and why we do is ultimately going to govern.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one of the greatest understandings that I've come into as I look back on my experience, both as, having been an attorney and then being on the inside and then now being an advocate and working with people, that though there is an intention of each person that's involved in the legal system. You have judges, you have prosecutors, you have defense attorneys, you have law enforcement, you have people in the correctional system, you have probation, you have the politicians, and each of them are subsections, right? But then the system itself, listen to me here, the system has an intention. This is the understanding that I came into, and it took me a while to figure this out. The intention of the whole will always override the intention of the subset. If you receive that, it will enlighten you on a whole nother level. And so one of the things that was baffling to me is that while in law school, we learned so much about the theory, I think it focused on theory and abstract, and that's wonderful. And even what the intention was of, for instance, the framers. Anybody that's listening to me that's taken a law class, that's one of the things they say, what's the intention of the framers, the people who created the law? Okay, and that's great. But I want to talk about the intention of an entire system.
Wow.
The intention of a system, which I am not ashamed to say, is a straight line from the transatlantic triangular trade. I want to be politically correct here because nobody says slavery anymore, to Jim Crow, to now what we see as mass incarceration. It's an intention. It is a system of intention. And when you get that, and this is the other part that I want to speak on, you don't build a hotel and don't want occupancy. In fact, you build a hotel because you think there'll be occupancy and you're going to encourage it a little bit. And so when we look at the wheels of the system, we have to go beyond, well, that judge, right? If you read my book, I talk about that judge. Well, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than the person that police officer on the street that made the arrest. There is a larger wheel that's in place. And that wheel, to be quite frank with you, Bishop, I don't even think most of the players in the system are aware of the intention of the whole. Because even if they were, I think it would help for them to be enlightened to know this is a much bigger force. And that force, and I'll end on this point, and I have no problem with saying this, the system, the intention of the system is a diabolical intention.
So this is I don't have any words for the knowledge that you are imparting to us right now, because this is vital. This information is vital, and that's why I'm encouraging you that are listening to share this. Share this with your children. Share this with your relatives. Share this with those who think that they're going to beat the system just because they're smart, they're witty, they're slick. No, you're not. So let me ask you this. Does this give credence to a very controversial piece of work that I read several years ago? And it hasn't really hit the mainstream media because it kind of echoed what you just said by Michelle Alexander. I'm sure you're familiar with a book she released on the new Jim Crow. And in the book, it talked about exactly what you said, that the whole system is designed to enslave, and that's the word she used in that, to create a caste system, that because slavery had been outlawed, she goes into it, and I can understand why this book never hit mainstream, because she lays right into it on a level where anybody reading it, like your book, can understand it. And she goes into the point that says that this system was created because slavery was outlawed, but this country still needed people to produce and to manufacture. And those of you who are listening who understand that so much is made in prison, so much of what we see is made in prison. And she says that this new Jim Crow, and that's why it's called the new Jim Crow. Why don't you elaborate? Because I think before we go any further, there's more to dig into when you talk about a system, not people, the way a system has been designed.
Yeah, well, I can say a few things about that. I'll start with saying, and for those of you that are listening, I would love to get a visual in the background so you know I'm not just making this up, but I was speaking at the New York Theological Seminary maybe about 2 years ago, and Michelle Alexander was actually in the audience in the front row. And I
Okay.
spoke with her a bit about her book, and she has a great amount of wisdom. But I say this, very confidently. Imagine the level of wisdom and insight that she shared with the world, and she never stepped foot in the system. So imagine someone who was trained in the law like I've been, and then went through the experience. Imagine what I have to release to the world. So
Right.
come back swinging is just the beginning. I've come into a whole level of understandings that I believe is going to shake the foundations of what we understand as law. So, I mean, she just scratched the surface because still she's speaking from not experience. She's still speaking from a position of academia and theory, and it is grounded in truth. But so if we talk about this system, right, and I want to be cognizant of using the word because sometimes it brings its own connotation, and I'm not talking down on the people that are involved with it. I think a
Right.
great
Right.
example is Marilyn Mosby, right? She was the former prosecutor within Baltimore City. She was actually the youngest chief prosecutor of any American city. And for those people that were following what was going on with Freddie Gray and what the officers had done in that case, she, as the prosecutor, the arm of the state, stood up and said, we're not going to stand for this, and we're going to prosecute these officers. They all but ran her out of that city. And I think she was surprised by how the system overrode her, even though she was supposed to be the spokesperson. Because therein lies the point. The intention of the system is always going to be bigger than any one person. It's always bigger. The whole is always more powerful than the subsection. And I think she was surprised that she's a prosecutor and she's the arm of the state, or at least a part of the arm of the state, and she's a spokesperson. And here she is wanting to hold accountable these officers, but there was something much bigger at play. And I think she saw what we all knew who have actually been on any of the other side of this. We understand that the intention of this thing that is so much larger, it is this force that's so much bigger that even when you have a person that wants to make a change, even when you have officers that want to do something, until we recognize that the intention of the thing and the force itself is sitting in the background, we end up at square one. So going back really quickly to this new Jim Crow, I think the crux of what Michelle Alexander was asserting is that there is a direct line between what we saw, the intention behind Jim Crow, which was, of course, to keep in place a status quo. Ultimately, I don't think it's about race. It is ultimately about power. Power concedes nothing without a demand, Frederick Douglass said. Nothing, ever, right? So when we look at what is of course, race plays a big part of this, but at the heart of it, this is a institution that has been put in place to keep the power structures that have been where they are. And
So,
go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So all the new Jim Crow, I think, is really saying, in probably more flowery and poetic language, is what was then is still now. That the plot has not changed. The characters have, but the plot remains the same. And this is where I end, until the actors on the stage recognize that there is a larger play, that there is a larger scene that is taking place, you'll never break free of the narrative.
So let's hash this out because you said a lot, and I want to hash it out for our listeners. Now, for the record, I agree with you when you said it's not about race, but it's more about power. So how do we justify that statement for someone that's listening, or even some of us that have been falsely accused, when we look at, let's use, for example, the crack epidemic of the 80s, when it has been documented that it was placed in the cities of Los Angeles. And then, of course, we know it spread against, which is actually an African American community. So how do we judge that target action in a black community in Watts, in Compton, to say it's not about race, it's about power. Let's kind of hash that out. So a person that is listening who says, no, I think it is about race. They always stop black people when they walk in. But you're talking about the bigger thing, the bigger picture, correct? Not
The bigger picture.
not the police that stops the individual. You're talking about the system and the way the system is designed to keep power with a few. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just wanted to make sure we hash that out, because everything from the media, from streaming to social media, race, race, race. And I've always said, I've always taken it a step further. It's not race. It's about green. It's about economics, and economics is linked with power.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is, let me say it this way. I want to invite and challenge people to raise your level of consciousness. I mean, certainly nobody can deny the statistics as they are, that, 3 out of every 4 people that find themselves ensnared in the system in some way are people of color. It's no accident, right? No, I'm not saying that it is not about race also, but I want to raise your level of consciousness to understand that race is partly what is used, right, to blind us to the larger picture.
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean? What do I mean? When we step back and we look at the fact that at the core it's power. Remember what I'm saying? At the core it's power.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when we look at those who find themselves powerless in our American system, more than not, it becomes us. So what we tend to think is this is all happening because we're black.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to say is the same diabolical system that is incarcerating or ensnaring people of color at a higher rate, that same system will roll over anybody, and is rolling over any and everybody that doesn't fit the power structure. And the power structure is not white people, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
It is a few families who have held wealth in this country for centuries. Now, they are white for most, as a most conception, right? So, and I think that's so hard for me. It's so much to say. That's why slavery lasted as long as it did. Because the ones that really benefited from slavery directly, it was really only a few. And those were the slave-holding families.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's still happening today. The problem is, I just got to speak frankly.
Go ahead.
When other people who are white think, well, and there is some ancillary benefit to being able to say, I look like the slaveholder. I look like the person that runs the company. I look like the person that's president of the country. But they run over you too. Ask Epstein. I had a cellmate, because I got to talk freely. I had a cellmate that said it like this. He said, there's 2 types of white people in this world, Darrell. You need to understand this. He was a 74-year-old black man from Alabama. He would always say, I think differently than you. I don't have a filter. And I said, well, what do you mean there's 2 different white people? He said, there's mighty whitey. Those are the ones that are running things. And it's all the other ones that are running around think that they are a part of that structure. And he said, you could start as a mighty whitey and end up in here with us. And I laughed at it because the truth of the matter is the power structure is most interested in keeping the structure exactly as is. And it will use race, it will use gender, ask Christine Blasey Ford, right? It will use any and everything that is needed at the forefront. It doesn't mean that it's not really using those things, but the goal is what the goal was initially, even with transatlantic slavery, which was wealth, power, influence, and dominance.
Wow.
And can I just say a little bit further? If white folk, I know I probably shouldn't say it like that, but I don't know another way to do it. Caucasian people, and I mean this in the best way, right? If they understood what this was really about, the whole thing would kind of collapse pretty quickly, because they would recognize that it's only 1% of 1% that are actually in the power structure. And once that, what's the old saying with the Nazis? They said they came for the gays and I said nothing, and they came for the communists and I said nothing, talking about the Nazis, and they came for the political dissidents and I said nothing, and then they came for me and there was nobody left for me. You better wake up. You better wake up. That these laws and the things that are ensnaring people, I knew some folks, and this will be the last story I'll tell. It was a guy on the inside. He had been a general. He had been a general in the military, and now he's a white man, and now he found himself in prison. And he was angry. He was angry. He was angry about everything that had transpired. He was angry about how could they do this to me? How could they not respect my rights? Because he was seeing himself on the other end. I mean, he had been in the power structure, and the way that his case went, I mean, it was really crazy, right? And it was another person who was listening and said, and I'm going to, give you the G-rated version, of course, out of respect. He says, I don't want to hear you sitting there talking because you were one of those people watching the TV 10 years ago and said, lock all them N-words up, lock them up. Mm-hmm. And you were probably watching the TV then. He said, but you didn't think that you'd be in here with us 20 years later.
Wow. Yeah. Listen, man, you talking some stuff. Now I've heard you do this before, but I think this is the realest and this is the kind of talk that I wanted. So
I'm pre-bishop.
Let me segue to something. And we may have to come back and do another podcast because I've been looking for a outlet to do this. I could have done it on a commentary, and I don't want to really go into this, but what you've said and what you've said about power and what you've said about money and what you said about the system takes me over to our sister, Whoopi Goldberg. And in my opinion, how she was able to be silenced on a show called The View. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that, so I don't know how far to go into this, but there have been other guests. Matter of fact, another host just got a slap on the hand 2 weeks ago for saying something that was out of context. But without going into that right now, what I want to bring out of what you said is that 1% is seeking and pretty much has done, if we be honest, a good job of it, of controlling not only the power, not only the wealth, but here's where I want to go. And you just talked about it, the consciousness, the mindset of an entire society. And that's why we call it wake up and see what is happening. If it can happen to Whoopi, if it happened to Nick, and I could go right on down. So Anyway, let me get out of that because the view is not the view. It's what we pay you to say and what we pay you to think. And if you think differently, if your view is different from our view, then we tell you to go stand in a corner for 2 weeks, come back, get on an apology tour, and denounce your view. All right, sir. That was my story.
Bishop, can I talk about that for a second?
I wish, yes. Yes.
No. Do we have time? Because I don't want to.
No. And what we need to do is come back and do a total podcast on that. But yes, sir. What are your thoughts on what I just said?
Quickly, 2 things here. I heard it said this way, those who control the words and the language control the narrative. That's why I'm so particular about language. That's why I'm so particular. Let me give you an instance. People say, oh, are you a criminal defense attorney? I defend the rights of the accused. I don't know criminals. See, the subtlety of language will control the narrative. And we have allowed the framers of people who created legislation, who in many cases have diabolical intent, we have allowed them to control the narrative. So we even say those things, a criminal defense attorney. I want to raise your level of consciousness and say, I defend the rights of the accused. And who among us has not been accused of something? I don't care how little or how big you might think it is, but you looked and said, I did not do that, right? The second thing I want to draw your attention to, for those people that like to watch things, watch 4 Hours at the Capitol. I believe it's on HBO Max. And it really chronicles the story of January 6th. I think January 6th was one of the greatest things that ever happened to this country. I
What's that
really
called?
do.
What's that called again? Say that one more time.
4 hours at the Capitol.
4 hours at the Capitol. Okay, great.
And it chronicles the story of these people, particularly. I mean, we know what happened on January 6th. It was an attempted coup that was brought down. We got to call it what it is. But I think what is interesting is this documentary follows people who have been in law enforcement their entire lives. I mean, they had fought for this country, and in some cases, maybe they were saying some of the same things about our people and the system and all these other things. And now, when they saw that their president would deny, and their former president to this day has denied what has happened on the ground, you can see their disillusionment, partly because they were a part of that. And you can tell, and then, can I go? I want to be respectful of how I say this. I have always wondered, why would someone, I'm talking about the officers after that Capitol, why would they kill themselves, right? Because people didn't die there. I mean, one woman was shot and killed, but I'm talking about, it wasn't massive loss of life. What do you think that was about? I think, and I say this respectfully, I think part of that was about what you see match the disillusionment you see on that 4 hours at the Capitol as they're giving interviews. People fought their whole lives believing that the system was one thing and that they were part of it. They believed in the goodness of it. And for them to see the ugly side of it, not the insurrection, let me be clear, but the fact that that same power structure now said, oh, that didn't happen. They helped escort Pence to safety, and he and his next breath was, oh, no, there's nothing that happened there, nothing to see here. And I think their disillusionment was to know, I was a part of it. That's why you got to wake up, because this thing can only be propped up. Even if it's the 1% that's at the top, it can only be propped up as long as the masses prop it up. But if you prop it up because you think because of your whiteness you're protected, because of some level of money you have because you're protected, because I'm going to Whoopi now, because you are in, I don't know, a celebrity or whatever that means you're protected, and you are propping up the system, now you had a rude awakening.
Ooh, that's a great place to end. That's powerful. That, sir, that right there is powerful. And that's why I am so delighted that you took your time to share just a little bit, just a corner of your knowledge and experience and even your academia, and you put it all together. And that's why I started off by saying your journey, our journeys are destined, because everything we get on that journey qualifies us to stand in our destiny. And if you hadn't been on both sides, sir, you would be like Michelle Alexander, as you so well put it. You would be academic, astute, you would be a scholar only, and you still are, but you wouldn't have the other side of the experience to call yourself a legal advocate. How can people access your website again?
Thank you, Bishop. They can find me. You can find me on, first of all, any of the social media platforms at Darrell Bennett, DarrellBennett. On all YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. But you can also find me online on the World Wide Web at www.darrellbennett.com. That's DarrellBennett. And if you want me to speak at your law school, or if you or just organization about what you've heard shared here, or you need legal representation and advocacy, you need to reach out to me, because we're doing some great work.
Absolutely. And he works also, he was very modest. He works with a lot of communities. He's the voice of New York. If you follow him online, you'll see him sticking up for the community, standing with law enforcement, political activists standing with him. So he's about a good work. So please follow him. Make sure you get the book, Come Back Swinging. And I'm excited about part 2 coming out. And we got to have him on the Wake Up podcast to talk about part 2 of his book. I am so excited. Sir, I know you're very busy. I know you're very productive. You're very fruitful. You're very much needed in what I would say a state of that is going through a major transition now. And I don't have time because I could do a whole podcast on what's happening in New York, even with the election of the new mayor and the election of the new governor, and this Pluto return, and enter Capricorn, which represents governments and systems. So you're in a very strategic place. And New York is being reborn, rebirthed. There's something emerging out of New York, and there's a move. There's a move. And so I said all that to say, in short, because I don't want to get into anything else, that you are strategically placed in the capital city. Because that's really the capital. But that's another podcast, right? We got about we talked about 4 different podcasts since we've been on here. And for those of you that are listening, when you awoke and you are intentional, as Darrell said earlier, information, revelation, insight, intuitiveness continues to loom over you. So that's why one subject leads to another subject, to another subject. Darrell Bennett, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Let's come back soon and talk about, let's just dissect so many of the powerful things that you talked about, because you've only scratched the surface on this Wake Up podcast.
Thank you, Bishop. I look forward to coming back, and I look forward to speaking more with the audience.
Absolutely. Till next time, this is Darnell Johnson III. Follow us. Wake Up DMV. Wake Up DMV. Follow Jay Brown, our co-host, JMVP_CEO. And until the next podcast, peace and stay woke.
So I do think, and I want to echo, thank you, Michelle, because I think your book opened up to the masses of this real issue, and it crossed the color lines for individuals to read our story.
When we look at the history of this country and look at what's happened now, it is not a mistake. You said it right, Isabel. It's not some serendipitous course of events. I mean, this is done on purpose, by a purpose, for a reason. The introduction made me look better than what I am. I graduated from Harvard, but I also spent time in federal prison. So I've seen both sides of life in that sense. And there is an intentionality behind it. You don't build hotels unless you want occupancy. They don't build prisons and then hope people don't come. In fact, they will create laws and policies and strategies to boost that. As far as the immigrant crisis, I would be careful of how I word that. I don't think we have a crisis of immigrants. This country was built on the backs of people who came to this country and who fought and died so people like me can sit on this stage freely. So this anger that has been projected towards immigrants is not only bewildering, but it's disturbing. And so the crisis is how now certain positions and people who are in power are using power in a negative way. Now we know, and the scripture is very clear on this, if you smite the shepherd, you will scatter the sheep. It is an effort to destroy Black and Hispanic men in this country, and I don't want to talk around it. I want to speak right directly to it. And so what has happened is there is an entire generation of people who are being raised without a father, without a male affirmation in the house. And so what we are seeing is this perpetuation of cycles that are not only going to lead us down a very negative road, but in a place where, unfortunately, if we don't do something now, and that's why I think discussions like this are important, but we must do something. Something has to be done because they're fighting for what they believe, even though it's wrong. And so we have a responsibility to stand up. And I'll say this, in closing, we are here today because people, church mothers and deacons and pastors sat in and sat up and boycotted. Some who rode buses, wouldn't ride buses 10, 20 miles walk because they would not participate in an unfair, unjust, and unequal system. And I think it is time we speak out against it and we do something about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. You speak to audiences across the country, across the globe, and try to connect them to the experiences of incarcerated people. Do you think the audiences you speak to understand the impact the system is having in their own community? And do you think I know. Do you think they feel empathy? And if not, how do we create more empathy in the people in those audiences?
That's a wonderful question, Deanna. So I think it depends on the audience that I'm speaking to. Maybe in some of the audiences in the inner city, yes. Maybe some of the law schools, not so much. One thing that I've tried to do is help people to understand that, I think giving a face to what incarceration looks like does wonders. And when I approach people and I speak about my story, I speak about my story in the sense of not just this physical incarceration, but this aspect of my life and decisions that I'm not proud of and the transformation. And I think that's something that everybody can empathize with. All of us, no matter where we've come from, can relate to having made decisions perhaps that we're not proud of. And we can relate to transforming and wanting transformation. And so I think as we speak specifically about this issue, I think the key is to understand that sometimes our help might not come from people who look like us. I don't want to call people out, but Paul and Katie, raise your hands. They are part of the reason I'm here, because Paul and Katie were instrumental in giving to Exodus. Julio Medina is the executive director there, and he was the first person to hire me when I was released from federal prison last year. So I think sometimes what happens is we have in our mind who our help is going to look like. And I find that God has a sense of humor, and he will hide something that we need and something we don't necessarily recognize at the time. And so I am grateful for people who are, and I think a lot more people, and if I could say that is the silver lining of the nastiness that has been played out on the national level now. I think people have come to grips with the fact we do have a problem. Under the Obama administration, I think we were post-racial and all this other stuff. Now people, I think, are clear that, we have a real serious issue in this country that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed quickly. And so because of that, I think more people are coming to the table, and it is important that we not shut people out just because they may not have had our same experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isabel, I think one of the reasons that reform is hard is that public policy and policymakers.
Yeah, but that's exactly it, Deanna. Thank you for that, because incarceration is really it's the symptom of the larger issue. And I think to talk about that issue in a vacuum is to miss everything else that's going on. By the time a young man or young woman is standing in front of a judge, it's already too late. And there are so many things that have been done before that to lead to that place, which is why we were talking about this, the fathers being taken out of the communities, because that starts it. It starts with people not even knowing who they are, a misunderstanding of identity. So wonder when we look in the schools, and by the time, they did a study that said that at 10 years old is really like the breaking period. And you see before then where, young people are, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, raising their hand and excited about what's going on. And they are excited to raise their hand if they know the answer. But around 10 and 11 is when that point comes where in many communities, in many of our communities, it's no longer cool to say you know the answer. And so it's a dimming of that light. So by the time the person is in maybe juvie or there is an arrest, in many cases, I don't want to say it's too late for there to be action, but it's already so many other things that have happened. So when we look at the education, I think is the biggest key. And I'm not just talking about education in a school. I'm talking about an understanding of who people are. And I'm talking about beyond race. This sense of, because I can't help but say this, when we begin to empower people to understand that there is greatness on the inside of you, you were made by the creator of the universe with purpose. You didn't just come through the birth canal, and you were not made by your parents. They would, and so I think when we begin to help people to understand, not in this self-aggrandizing way, but in this very concrete way, you have gifts, you have something that you can add to this world. People can begin to take pride in that. And so school becomes less about, let me learn about how every other culture is great besides mine, but it becomes now a conduit to help me to unlock the potential that's on the inside of me. So as we do that, I believe that we can begin to really help people to see in a very concrete and real way, you have worth and we need you to be who you've been designed to be. Communities are dying because people are not being who they've been called to be.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Just to add, well, that was well said. Thank you. Just to add, I like.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. This is a wonderful conference because people want to do something. And many of us in this room are doing something about this. And I think that that's very important, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. As far as what I would like people to take from my story, I want people to know that no matter what has happened in your life, you can be restored. And that's been the story of my life. I actually wrote Come Back Swinging, and I wrote this book partly while I was on the inside, and when I was released, I didn't know how to share the story. It's a vulnerable story. I talk about the trauma that led to some poor decisions. I talk about being introduced to sex at the age of 5 years old. I talk about the darkness in my life, even at so-called high points at law school and the things that people saw on the outside. And what I recognize is that nothing starts as a tree. It always starts as a seed. And we have a tendency to look around at the tree like, how did that happen? But it started somewhere. And my story, and this is why I wrote Come Back Swinging, and it's not a bombastic sort of like, rah-rah type thing, but it is to remind people about our voices again, that you can be restored. I've been restored by an almighty God who saw past my faults and saw my need. The same God that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt after 430 years of bondage, and that is still in the business of restoring people. And I think as we go into the workshops, I want people to think about, what are you doing right where you are with what you have to help someone? I think as we talk about changing the world, changing the nation, changing communities, that can become so grand that it's hard for us to kind of see that in our minds. But how are you helping somebody right where you are? For some people, it's a child who's looking to you and who needs you. And so I'm excited to be a part of this. Again, this comeback swing. And I got to say this really quickly. I stand on the shoulders of people like Miss Alexander. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean that. I walked in here. I said, oh my gosh, she's here. So that picture will be on Instagram later. But really, I read your book like 3 times in law school. And so we all have a story. This is just a piece of mine. And I want you to share yours.